If you would like a certificate of attendance after today's webinar, look for a follow-up email in your mailbox 1 hour after the webinar concludes, or look for the link on our YouTube channel in the webinar description. It will contain instructions on how to get your certificate. If you have questions during the live webinar, you may type them into your GoToWebinar control panel. If you're watching a recording of this webinar, you may email questions to the presenter at info@johnson-center.org. Today's webinar was prepared and presented by Amanda Tami. Amanda is a licensed professional counselor and board-certified behavioral analyst who oversees the behavioral and counseling programs here at the Johnson Center. Her compassion, knowledge, and dedication make her an invaluable member of our community. Please welcome Amanda Tami.
Thank you, and thank you for being here today. We're going to be talking about ADHD. What is it? Who's at risk? And what do I do about it? This is part one of a two-part series. We're breaking this into two webinars because there's just so much to cover. And even doing this as two webinars, there's no way I can possibly cover all of it. So I'm going to give you some resources where you can find some more information, and I will cover as much as I can. You can send in questions. Know that I can't answer any specific questions about an individual or a specific case, as I wouldn't have enough information to give a clinical opinion, but I can answer general questions about what ADHD is and who's at risk and treatment options. So today we're going to cover what ADHD is and who is at risk for it, and I'll cover treatment options and strategies in part two of this webinar, which we will do 1 week from today on November 14th. If you haven't already registered for part two, please do. If you can't make it, all of our webinars are posted on the Johnson Center's YouTube channel to view at your convenience. So there's a whole lot to cover today, so let's jump right in. Today we're going to start by covering the DSM diagnostic criteria for a formal diagnosis of ADHD and presentations of ADHD. Then we'll talk about what ADHD looks like and the challenges individuals with ADHD might have. And we'll finish with who's at risk for ADHD and comorbid conditions that are common with it. So let's start with diagnosing ADHD. According to the DSM-5, which is the Manual of Diagnostic Criteria for Mental Health Disorders, ADHD is a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity and impulsivity that interferes with functioning in two or more settings beginning before 12 years old that's not otherwise explained by another DSM diagnosis, meaning that pattern of inattention or that pattern of hyperactivity and impulsivity is not due to some other mental health condition. To qualify for a diagnosis, a child needs to exhibit 6 or more of the 9 listed symptoms for that type. Adults need 5 or more symptoms. So the two types are inattentive and hyperactive impulsive. So to qualify for a diagnosis, you need 6 or more symptoms for that type, or for an adult 5. Here you can see the list of the 9 symptoms in the DSM for each type of ADHD. Inattention symptoms are things like difficulty sustaining attention in a task, not following through to finish a task, trouble getting organized, being easily distracted, forgetfulness. While hyperactivity and impulsivity symptoms are things like fidgeting, getting out of your seat, talking excessively, having trouble waiting your turn. Now all of these symptoms are things that we all experience sometimes. Everyone has had trouble following through to finish a task, or being restless when we have to sit in the seat for a long time. The difference is that in ADHD, these things are a persistent pattern. They happen very frequently, and they happen in any environment, not just when we didn't get enough sleep or when we're really anxious for something. They happen all the time. So the symptoms that are present in those two categories determine the presentation of ADHD. Is it an attentive presentation, in which there are 6 or more inattentive symptoms? hyperactive impulsive presentation, where there are 6 or more hyperactive symptoms, or combined presentation. In combined presentation, there are 6 or more from each category, not 6 total symptoms, but 6 or more inattentive symptoms and 6 or more hyperactive symptoms. Some people argue that making these distinctions between the presentations is kind of irrelevant, because most people with ADHD show symptoms of both presentations over the course of their lifetime. It's more common for younger children to present as hyperactive, but as the child gets older, that hyperactivity turns into increase in attention. And the comorbid type is the most common. But this is the current diagnostic criteria, and these are how someone would be labeled as their presentation. I just want you to be aware that the presentation your child falls into now might not be the best fit in the future. There are lots of other conditions that can be comorbid with ADHD. Comorbidity means that other disorders co-occur with ADHD. So having ADHD increases the likelihood that certain other psychiatric disorders would be present. We'll talk more about those comorbid disorders later, but it's really important that you get a thorough evaluation with someone who is experienced with evaluating ADHD and knows a lot about it, so that that person can identify when ADHD is present among any of those comorbid conditions, and can identify what those comorbid conditions are that might be alongside ADHD. It's really important to recognize any conditions that are present so that all can be treated effectively. You don't want to attribute the symptoms of one condition to another, masking the presence of that other condition, and then that other condition doesn't get treated. So who do you see for an ADHD diagnosis and treatment? A psychologist, psychiatrist, developmental pediatrician, or neurologist are typically the people who you would see to do the testing for an ADHD diagnosis. This is true no matter the age, children and adults. Well, adults would typically not see a developmental pediatrician, but psychologists, psychiatrists, or neurologists can evaluate an adult. But the key is finding someone who is thorough and uses standardized assessments to support the diagnosis. Like I just said, the evaluation is really important, and that person has to be able to. ADHD can be kind of tricky because of all those possible comorbid conditions. So the person doing the evaluation needs to have the experience and knowledge to be able to tease all of that out. For treatment, depending on the route that you want to take for treatment and which options you want to use, there are any number of people who you can see. We'll talk more about the different treatment options in part 2 of this webinar, but generally the paths to treatment that you could take would be medication, behavioral strategies, or alternative treatments. So if you want to use medication to treat ADHD, you'll see a medical doctor. A psychiatrist is a specialist in psychiatric medication, mental health disorders, and the medications that treat them. So you can see a psychiatrist for ADHD medication, but your primary care doctor might also be able to prescribe the medication once you have the diagnosis. For behavioral interventions, you could see a behavior analyst, counselor, psychologist, or school mental health professional for help. And you can see a dietitian or nutritionist for supplements and dietary options, other natural options and alternatives. So that's the criteria for an official diagnosis. But what does all that mean to the daily living of someone with ADHD? Let's talk about what ADHD is. Well, first, ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning the person shows age-inappropriate behavior. It's not behavior that is abnormal for humans. It's just not age appropriate. It is the failure of something to develop on schedule. In this case, it's different parts of the brain and cognitive processes. So think back to some of those symptoms for a diagnosis. Interrupting, trouble waiting turns, difficulty sustaining attention, being easily distracted. These are all things that we would expect young children to struggle with. For a young child, they're normal. But as that child gets older, we would expect these things to improve. In ADHD, these abilities are not developing on schedule. By adulthood, many of the physiological brain differences level out, but many adults with ADHD continue to struggle with elements of ADHD into adulthood, or many children with ADHD continue to struggle into adulthood, even though some of the brain differences have normalized. So again, ADHD is due to brain differences, but it affects behavior. This behavior is not caused by bad parenting, moral failings, a lazy child. It is a biological developmental condition. And although it impacts learning, individuals with ADHD can be very smart and have great areas of talent. So this disorder is called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but that's a little bit misleading. As I said earlier, the hyperactivity often turns into inattention, and the inattention in ADHD is not just having a hard time paying attention. People often dismiss the seriousness of ADHD because they think it's just about paying attention, but it's really much more than that. ADHD can be thought of as a failure of persistence. Persistence is needed for sustaining actions toward a goal long enough to attain that goal. This is future-directed behavior and motivation, delaying gratification to achieve a goal in the future. In ADHD, the brain is unable to resist distractions and unable to persist toward that goal. Now, when I talk about a long-term goal or I talk about a future goal, I don't mean something that's far in the future. I'm not talking about a 5-year plan. A long-term goal can be something like finishing 15 minutes worth of homework. Anytime the consequences are delayed, the goal is long-term. And delayed consequences means they're not immediate. They're not within a few seconds of the action. So I'll be talking about long-term goals a few times in this presentation. Keep in mind that a long-term goal might not be as long-term as you're thinking. So failure of persistence results in an inability to self-regulate. Self-regulation is one of those buzzwords that we hear all the time, but what is self-regulation? Self-regulation means that you are directing a behavior back at yourself in order to change your behavior from what it would have been if you had acted on impulse. So self-regulation is the ability to stop yourself, do something other than act on impulse. And why would you need to do this? In order to change some distant condition, in order to reach a long-term goal for delayed gratification. If you can't persist in a behavior, the opposite side of that coin is acting on impulse. You can't regulate yourself to not act on that impulse. So ADHD can be thought of as a deficit in persistence and in self-regulation. It's much less about attention or hyperactivity, as the name says. So how do we self-regulate? We use another one of those buzzwords, something you've probably heard of a lot, executive functions. Now I'm going to use Russell Barkley's definition of executive functions. Russell Barkley is an expert on ADHD, and I'm going to talk more about him later when I go over some resources for more information. But according to him, executive functions are the actions that we direct at ourselves to change behavior. So self-regulation is the process of directing an action back at ourselves, and executive functions are those actions. It's what you're doing to yourself. You use self-directed action in order to reach that larger, non-immediate goal. There are 5 executive functions: inhibition, nonverbal working memory, which is our mental imagery, hindsight and foresight; verbal working memory, which is our internal voice or internal language; emotion regulation and motivation; and planning and problem solving to find new options. Depending on where you look or who you're talking to, you might find that other sources describe more or fewer than 5 executive functions, but it really just depends on how someone groups them. Some people might separate planning and problem solving into 2 separate executive functions, or emotion and motivation, they might separate those, or some people might combine verbal and nonverbal working memory. So the number of executive functions is really not as important as understanding what each of them does. Now, each of the executive functions builds on the earlier ones. Inhibition is typically the first to develop, and you can't have nonverbal working memory if you don't have inhibition. You can't have verbal working memory without nonverbal working memory, and etc. So when one of the executive functions is impaired, the others above it on the pyramid will also be less effective. Inhibition is the first executive function, and it's the earliest to develop. Most kids begin to develop inhibition around preschool age. If the development of inhibition is delayed, at that age it first appears as hyperactivity. The child is not able to suppress or inhibit motor behavior. This is how it first appears. So the child talks a lot and is kind of always on the go. Hyperactivity typically decreases with age and turns into what we think of as inattention, and you can think of inattention as the need for internal activity. The person might still show restlessness, but more prominently you see jumps from one activity or topic to another, and the inability to persist mentally in a task. The inability to inhibit, or disinhibition, can present in several ways. First is impulsiveness. You can't stop a response. When a person is impulsive, they make snap decisions and act without thinking. The second is perseveration. Perseveration means that you continue to do something when you should have shifted to a different activity. When inhibition is impaired, it's really hard to interrupt an ongoing behavior when it's time to switch to do something else, when that ongoing activity is interesting. And if you can't stop the ongoing behavior, you can't initiate the new task. And finally, inhibition protects us from distraction. So without inhibition, we can't suppress unwanted reactions to distractions. People with ADHD don't perceive distractions better than others, or they don't have more distractions in their environment. Rather, the difference is that they fail to inhibit their response to those distractions. Everyone hears the loud truck go by outside, but the person with ADHD can't stop himself from getting up and running to the window to look. We'll talk more about strategies to help with the symptoms of ADHD in part 2 of this webinar next week. But it's important that you have an understanding of disinhibition so that you can appropriately find ways to compensate. Generally, people with ADHD have the same knowledge that the general population has. They know the consequences of actions. Now, with certain comorbid disorders, that might be different. So, for example, if someone has ADHD and autism, they might have social impairments that the general population does not have, so they don't have the knowledge of how their behavior is going to the social consequences that their behavior might have. But generally, if we're thinking only about ADHD, most people with ADHD, again, not thinking about any comorbid conditions that might affect this, but someone with ADHD has the same knowledge that the general population has. They know the consequences of their actions. So, for example, they know that if they draw on the wall with a permanent marker, it won't come off and that they'll get in trouble. They know that. The problem is that when the idea of writing on the wall with the marker pops into their head, they have no inhibition. There's no pause, so there is no opportunity to think through the consequence. They're not thinking through their actions, but that's not really the problem here. The problem is that they're not able to stop so that they could do so. So using interventions like the stop, opt, go tools or other thinking ahead tools might not be effective. They don't address the real problem. The problem is that their ability to stop is impaired. They're not choosing not to stop, they're not able to. So we need to intervene in ways to help them stop rather than intervening by trying to teach them to think through the consequences. They know the consequences and they can think through it and know that they should or shouldn't do something if they're able to stop. So, for example, a child knows that they need to wait their turn when they're playing with the equipment on the playground. We don't need to teach them to think about what's going to happen if they cut to the front of the line. They already know that the other kid won't want to play with them. They already know that's what's going to happen. So rather than trying to teach them that or say, or think about it before you do it, what are you going to do? What's going to happen if you do this? We instead need to help them stop rather than act so that they have a pause and so that they can think it through. They'll come to the right conclusion if they can stop and think about it. I also want to mention real quick that I'm giving lots of examples about children, and I say help your child with ADHD, but all of these things that I'm saying also apply to adults. The same challenges, the same strategies, the same diagnostic criteria. It's the same for children and adults. Adults are going to have the same types of struggles as a child would. So the only difference is that to be diagnosed, an adult needs 5 symptoms, whereas a child needs 6. But if it's you who has ADHD or a spouse or another adult in your life, this information is the same regardless of age. So don't think that because I keep saying child that it's different. It's the same for children or adults. Okay, so the next executive function is working memory, and it has 2 parts, nonverbal and verbal. Working memory is the ability to hold information in mind. When working memory is poor, you often forget things, forget what you're doing, you forget where you're going, you forget how you're getting there. And we've all had that experience before, and unfortunately for all of us, working memory declines with age, so we can expect that experience to happen more frequently as we get older. But in ADHD, that impairment is there from the start, and it happens all the time. Working memory is what allows us to re-engage in an incomplete goal. If we start something, working memory keeps that goal in mind. If we get distracted or we stop or we take a break, we remember the goal and we re-engage in the activity. In ADHD, as soon as a distraction arises, the goal is gone. working memory isn't there to bring us back to the goal and get us back on track. Nonverbal working memory is mental imagery of related experiences. We look back at things that happened in the past to anticipate what's going to happen in the future. So we look back at things that happened that were similar to this to figure out what's going to happen next, or what's going to happen if I do this. In ADHD, the person is not really able to do this because there's no delay between the stimulus and the response, between stimulus and action, i.e., inhibition. There is no recall of this information, and therefore, there is no foresight to the consequences. There's also no concept of time, because our concept of time is based on our past experiences. And in addition, there's only the immediate future. All there is what's happening right now. There's no foresight to the long term. As a result, there are impairments in time management. The person is not thinking about the future consequences before they act, and the person will always procrastinate and put things off until the last minute because they can only attend to what's immediately in front of them, those immediate consequences. What do I need to do right now? They aren't thinking ahead to what's going to happen in several days, that I need to finish this assignment by Friday, and it's Tuesday, so I need to start planning ahead so I can get it done. No, that Friday is way too far delayed. They cannot attend to what's going to happen on Friday. So once that task that's been put off is immediately due, they'll do it. Come Friday, well, now the consequence is immediate. I got to get it done. So, and on top of all that, what was learned previously is always separated from the present. They're not using hindsight to figure out what happened before, so they can't apply that to the current situation. Parents and teachers can get really frustrated when a child doesn't use what he doesn't seem to be learning from his experience. But in the case of ADHD, the child has to learn from the same experience over and over because of these challenges with nonverbal working memory. They can't take this, well, the last time I did this, this is what happened, so I better do it differently this time. They're because of the inhibition and working memory impairments, they're not able to do that. And regarding this, the neuroscientist Patricia Goldman-Rakic described working memory deficit as, I like this description, viewing the world as a series of unconnected events, like a set of unrelated slides, rather than a continuous sequence like a movie. So the rest of us are able to connect cause and effect in our lives, but those with ADHD struggle to do so. Now, verbal working memory is the voice in our head that tells us what to do. It's the use of language to hold information in mind. There's a lot of research showing that for kids with ADHD, the development of this private internal voice is delayed. They develop this later than their peers. And you might be asking, well, big deal, so they're not narrating their lives the way other people are, they're not talking to themselves in their head the way other people are. That doesn't seem like it would be related to working memory. But verbal working memory is more than that. Verbal working memory is our thoughts. It's all of the words and the numbers and the information that we try to hold in mind. So if you try to do an addition problem in your head, we're holding two numbers together and doing that arithmetic process, and that is verbal. Those numbers are verbal. If you have a question, but you have to wait until a pause to ask it, that is verbal information that you're holding. By the time you get to the pause, the question might be gone if your working memory is impaired. I know it happens to me all the time. I go to Google something, and by the time I open Google, I have forgotten what it is that I was going to look up. These are all verbal working memory processes. And if you can't hold the information in mind, you can't do anything with that information. Okay, next is emotion regulation. This is another one of the executive functions and is impaired in ADHD. And as a result of that impairment, many people with ADHD have emotional impulsivity. This can look like quickness to anger, being easily excitable, having a low frustration tolerance. They display emotions more quickly and more intensely than other people do. Now, their emotions, what they're feeling, is not inappropriate. What they're feeling is what other people would feel in the same situation. The difference is that their ability to regulate it is impaired, is inappropriate. This may be different if there are comorbid mood disorders alongside ADHD. So if the person has depression or bipolar disorder, then the feelings that they are experiencing might not be what's expected. The feelings might be inappropriate. But thinking only of ADHD, not factoring in comorbid mood disorders at this point. For ADHD only, generally what they're feeling is not inappropriate. The difference is that they're not able to regulate it the way other people would. So their feelings are not appropriate, they just have an intense, inappropriate display of emotions. And this is due to two things. Number one is a lack of emotional self-control. Emotional self-control is the ability to voluntarily suppress an emotional response. You still feel it, but you don't show it. And part of the way that you do this is, number two, the ability to downregulate. And people with ADHD or anyone who has difficulties with emotion regulation, not just someone with ADHD, but anyone with difficulty with emotion regulation has an inability to downregulate. Downregulate means going from an intense emotional state where you feel emotion very highly down to closer to neutral. And you do this by self-soothing, distraction, creating a new emotional state, like imagining your happy place, or imagine yourself drawing. You're creating in your mind this a different emotional state than what you're experiencing. And that helps you get to that different emotional state. All of these things require self-talk and mental imagery, both of which require working memory, which is impaired. Emotional impulsiveness underlies many of the relationship problems that are common in people with ADHD. It makes it really hard to maintain friendships. It puts strain on family relationships. And it's really common, really common for kids with ADHD to have social problems. Emotional impulsivity also applies to happy emotions. If a child gets really excited, they also have an inability to suppress it and to downregulate. This is not only for unhappy emotions. It's most obvious, and I think we most think of it as far as anger, having a really intense angry response, or sadness, that maybe the level of sadness that they're showing is not what you would expect for the size of the problem. But it can also be for happiness, for excitement, that they get really excited and show a level of happiness or excitement that you wouldn't expect for the situation. And finally, the last of the executive functions is planning and problem solving. This mental process refers to the ability to think through the steps of a process and generate multiple future options. It's manipulating information to get new information. this is what I have, this is what I can do with it. Or here's the problem, here are 4 possible solutions. That's planning and problem solving. But if there is no working memory, the person is not able to hold information in mind in order to manipulate it. Mental manipulation of information is needed for everything from solving an addition problem to writing a paragraph to brainstorming a brand new idea. If you can't persist in holding the information in mind, you can't do anything with that information. So for example, if you can't hold 5 plus 3 in your mind, you can't get 8. You also can't put your information or your experiences together to come up with a new solution or see things in a different way, or you can't even pull all the pieces together to start a new task. Initiating a new task requires a lot of pieces coming together at the same time. You have to stop what you're doing, you have to have some way to transition, you have to know the first step of the new task, you have to have all the information or materials for it. So initiating a new task requires that you can hold a lot of information together, manipulate it, and then carry it out. So how much of a delay should we expect to see? Well, Russell Barkley describes that on average, this is average, could be more or less for any individual, the brain maturity of a person with ADHD is about 30% behind their age. So the executive brain functioning of a 10-year-old with ADHD is approximately that of a 7-year-old. And because we're thinking about this as a percentage, 30% behind, that gap gets wider with age. So for a 10-year-old, there's a 3-year difference on average. For a 16-year-old, there's a 5-year difference. Now, because your 10-year-old executive functions are similar to that of a 7-year-old, you need to treat them more like a 7-year-old when it comes to any tasks that are affected by their ADHD symptoms. So how would you expect a 7-year-old to do homework? Probably with lots of help and with lots of breaks. So that's how you should expect your 10-year-old with ADHD to do their homework. Is a 7-year-old ready to be home alone for an hour after school? Maybe your 10-year-old with ADHD isn't ready for that either. Some areas of function are behind their chronological age, so you need to change your expectations to meet them where they are. Otherwise, you're setting them up to fail at something that their brain does not have the capacity to do. Emotional immaturity is also common. A child with ADHD might have a reaction that you'd expect from a much younger child. And this goes back to the emotional impulsivity that I talked about a few minutes ago. They don't have the ability to suppress their emotions or to downregulate that other kids their age have already at least begun to learn. So thinking about those executive functions that can be impaired, it makes sense that people with ADHD engage in risk-taking behaviors at much higher rates than the general population. The lack of inhibition, the difficulty with foresight, the emotional impulsivity, all make for poor snap decisions. People with ADHD are at higher risk for getting injured in accidents in various activities, higher risk for teenage pregnancy, dangerous driving, failing out of college, drug use, legal trouble. Often this behavior is not intentional. These individuals know the consequences of these risky behaviors. They're just unable to regulate, unable to inhibit the behavior, so they act on impulse without thinking of the consequence. Some of these risky behaviors are even more likely and more intense with some comorbid disorders, which we will move on to now. So now that we have a better understanding of what ADHD is and why it affects your child the way it does, let's talk about who's at risk for having ADHD and what goes along with it. It's estimated that 5 to 11% of U.S. children has ADHD. That range, 5 to 11%, is because different sources have different numbers. The American Psychiatric Association says 5%, the CDC says 11%. The number of adults diagnosed with ADHD is much lower, but it will be interesting to see over the next several years whether that number goes up as awareness of ADHD lasting into adulthood increases, as well as the number of adults who are being diagnosed for the first time with ADHD when they had ADHD as children but were not diagnosed until now, which is happening more frequently. Males are 3 times more likely than females to have it. And if a parent has ADHD, the chance of a child having ADHD is much higher. 35% or more of children with ADHD have a parent or sibling with the disorder. This number is probably low because many adults with ADHD have never been diagnosed. So it is a highly genetic disorder, but there are some environmental stimuli that can contribute to ADHD. For example, exposure to lead, prenatal alcohol and cigarette smoke exposure, traumatic brain injury can all contribute to the development of ADHD. Social factors do not cause ADHD. Social factors being things like parenting, friendships, peer relationships, school environment, those do not cause ADHD. But the symptoms of ADHD can have a negative effect on social relationships. And those social factors like parenting and relationships and environment, those social factors can contribute to some of the disorders that can be comorbid with ADHD. So although they don't cause ADHD, they can be affected by ADHD and they can create some secondary symptoms. And furthermore, the level of impairment that you see depends on the child's environment. People with ADHD might all experience some of the same types of symptoms, but some people might appear more severe or might appear worse than others because of the environment that they're in. If they're in a highly structured environment that supports their needs, you're likely to see fewer impairments. A supportive environment with lots of structure is really important for people with ADHD. Although people with ADHD can struggle, they can be really successful and bright and do really well with certain environments and certain modifications. And we'll talk about how to make an environment supportive in part 2 of this webinar next week. There are several other psychiatric disorders that are often present when ADHD is present. They're not always present. It's possible to have ADHD alone, but having ADHD makes some other conditions more likely, and the reverse is also true. Having certain other conditions makes ADHD more likely. For each of the conditions that we're going to talk about, it doesn't necessarily go in both directions. ADHD might make another condition more likely, or that other condition might make ADHD more likely, but it's not always the case that both leads to higher rates of the other. So the first is oppositional defiant disorder, also called ODD. This is the #1 co-occurring disorder with ADHD, the most frequently co-diagnosed. A diagnosis of ODD, the diagnostic criteria for ODD, are mood symptoms and behavioral symptoms. Mood symptoms are things like short temper, easy to anger, low frustration tolerance, and behavior symptoms are things like being argumentative, defiant, spiteful, not taking responsibility for mistakes. And remember that earlier I said that one of the executive functions that's impaired in ADHD is emotion regulation, and this impairment looks very similar to those mood symptoms I just described for ODD. So if you have ADHD, sometimes you're already halfway to ODD, and that's why it's so common that they occur together. Learning disorders are also common to see comorbid with ADHD. Handwriting, reading comprehension, reading speed, and writing challenges in particular. These challenges may be, at least in part, due to the impairments in working memory. Remember, if you can't hold the information in mind, you can't really comprehend it or hold it to figure it out. You can't hold the information to put multiple ideas together. You can't remember what you've read. You can't hold the information in mind while you're writing it at the same time. So learning disorders are quite commonly co-diagnosed with ADHD. Autism and ADHD also co-occur frequently. This may be because autism and ADHD can affect the same areas of the brain, and there is some overlap in symptoms. Some research also suggests that there could be a common gene between the two, but it is possible and actually quite common for someone with autism to also have ADHD. Anxiety and depression can be due to secondary symptoms of ADHD. So if the primary symptoms are those things that are needed for a diagnosis, difficulty sustaining attention, easily distracted, trouble with organization, restlessness, frequently getting out of their seat or interrupting. If those are the primary symptoms, secondary symptoms are problems that a child might face because of those primary symptoms. So secondary symptoms can be things like low self-esteem, conflicts in interpersonal relationships, friendships, or family, having lots of frustration with school, having lots of failure in school rather than success, gaining a fear of trying new things or new experiences. All of these can get to the point of being clinically significant anxiety or depression. Bipolar disorder is also comorbid with ADHD. If you have bipolar disorder, you are more likely to have ADHD. The opposite is not true. ADHD alone does not increase the likelihood of having bipolar disorder unless there is a family history of bipolar disorder. In that case, the chance of having bipolar disorder, if you have ADHD, is higher. And conduct disorder and substance abuse disorders are also more common in ADHD, and this is especially true if ODD, oppositional defiant disorder, is also present. Okay, so remember, this webinar is an overview of ADHD. There's a whole lot of information, and here are some resources where you can find more detailed explanations. I can't possibly cover everything, but please do plan to join us next week for part 2, where we'll cover what to do about ADHD. Okay, so Russell Barkley has the book Taking Charge of ADHD, which is a great resource. He also has several YouTube videos that give really good explanations of ADHD. Lots of good information. It's really easy to understand. Now, he strongly advocates for using medication for treatment, but even if you disagree with him on that point, his explanations and information about ADHD are very helpful. Parenting Children with ADHD, 10 Lessons That Medicine Cannot Teach, and Straight Talk About Psychiatric Medications for Kids. Both talk about possible medications that a child or an adult would take for treatment for ADHD and the risks and benefits. Driven to Distraction and the Smart But Scattered books. There are lots of Smart But Scattered books for kids and adults in school and all kinds of variations. And these books give lots of strategies for how to organize your environment or behavioral strategies that you can use. And we're going to talk a lot about that in part 2 of the webinar. AttitudeMag.com is another great resource. It's online, it's easy to access, and they just have tons of information that's easy to understand, written for anyone. They also have, I guess you could call it it's like a forum where they have where you can share your experience with different treatment options. So if you're thinking about trying Stratera, you might go to that forum on AttitudeMag.com and see what other people had to say about it. Or maybe you're going to try fish oil, and you go onto the forum and see, and people might put, that their child had these side effects, but this was the progress that we saw, and stuff like that. ldonline.org is for learningdisordersonline.org, and they also provide lots of behavioral strategies and organizational strategies that are also effective for our kids with ADHD. DoToLearn.com allows you to make visual and manipulative tools, to tailor it to your needs, and you can print it and make it exactly what you need. The Johnson Center has a webinar on organizational strategies for students in middle school and up with ASD. It's available on the Johnson Center's YouTube channel. It's by our psychologist, Dr. Claire Schutte. Another great resource for that organizational and behavioral strategies that we'll talk about in part 2, how those are effective and how they help. And social skills programs that include natural environment components. Also, in part 2, we'll talk about the need for intervention at the point of performance rather than classroom instruction. When this happens, this is what you should do. They're not going to be able to stop and remember to use that strategy. So intervention at the point of performance is really important, which we'll talk about next time. Okay, so I have, looks like just a few minutes, but let me see what I have. Okay, I'm seeing several variations of this question. Why does my kid have so much trouble paying attention in school, but he has no trouble paying attention to a video game for hours? And that's a good question, or one that I get a lot. And I think lots of kids and even adults have it's much easier to pay attention to a video game for a long time than it is to pay attention in school or to homework or something that's less exciting, that's less fun. But it can be especially problematic for someone with ADHD. And the reason is that a video game provides constant reinforcement. Every action that you take in a video game has an immediate consequence. You press this button and your person jumps over the other player, or you do this too fast and your player dies. And even if your player dies, it's frustrating, but you get to start over immediately. When consequences are immediate, it's much easier to persist. In school, though, or for most things in life, really, not just school, but for almost everything, the consequences are delayed. So if you're doing a math worksheet, you finish a math problem, there's no consequence. There's no consequence until you finish the entire worksheet. Or maybe even there's no consequence for finishing it until the end of the week when you get it back with a grade on it. That consequence is so delayed that it is not motivating. So most things don't have the immediate consequences that video games offer. And that is what makes video games so hard to stop. Also, you'll remember that I mentioned in talking about inhibition that part of that is perseveration, continuing when you should have stopped. And this is especially a problem when what you're doing is really fun or interesting to you. So because of the challenges with inhibition, perseveration is more likely, and it makes it harder for the person to stop doing that interesting thing and transition to a less interesting activity. Okay, I'm almost out of time. If you would like a certificate of attendance, look for a follow-up email that will be coming in the next 24 hours. This will have a link to a short quiz that once you complete will allow you to download a certificate. To receive updates on the webinar schedule, follow us on Facebook or Twitter, or sign up for email notifications. And for more information about the Johnson Center services, contact us at info@johnson-center.org or 512-732-8400. I thank you so much for being here today. And again, please join us next week for part 2 when we'll go over strategies and treatment options for people with ADHD.